Preface: Exploring Society and Human Nature. I once read an essay by an Englishman entitled China, Land of 1,000 Identical Cities. A sentiment I heartily endorse. Most of China's cities were rebuilt from the post-war rubble under the historical circumstances and policies of new China, and have followed similar patterns of development. This development process has typically involved the growth of criminal gangs, which, like their host cities, share many similarities. It's safe to assume that criminal gangs, like Tangshan's notorious Cleaver Squad, emerged in most of these 1,000 identical cities in the 1980s, along with hooligan bands consisting largely of the sons of employees of massive state-owned factories. The 1990s saw the emergence of many debt collection agencies of dubious background. I grew up in a city in northern China with a population of less than 1 million, and worked my way into the hard-won comfort of a white-collar existence in Shanghai. I was never involved in the criminal underworld, but an old family friend has been my hometown's generally acknowledged big brother for 20 years, and I personally witnessed much of his tumultuous rise in the gang world. I haven't written this book with the intention of luring readers into a life of crime. I'm sure that 80% of the people who finish this book will vow never to have anything to do with the criminal underworld, and I hope that some who are currently involved in the underworld, perhaps even some big brothers, will scale back their violence after reading it. This novel may turn out to be very long, perhaps as many as 1 million words. Although it focuses on the hooligans and criminal underworld in my hometown over the past 20-odd years, I hope readers will see more in it than this. I hope they will see what has happened and what has changed in our country and our society over the past 2 decades, and how our spiritual and material existence has been transformed. The things I'm exploring are society and human nature. While visiting this book's protagonist during Spring Festival last year, I came across a photo album that could be called a living encyclopedia of the underworld. It stirred up many feelings in me. 2 things were consistent in all of the photos. This big brother always sat in the center, and everyone in the photos wore dazzling smiles. 3 things changed as the album progressed. The people in the photos were different from year to year, with some in prison, on the run, recovering in a hospital, or permanently disabled. I found that the further into the album I flipped, the more complicated the expressions in their eyes became, even though they wore the same cheerful smiles. From polyester Mao jackets to woolen versions and then to white ones, and from white shirts and crimson ties to black suits and black ties. They became increasingly fastidious about their attire. The album presented an evolutionary history of the Chinese male wardrobe. I knew most of the people in the album and what had become of them. Seeing some of them made me weep, while others aroused my pity and still others my disgust. That's when I decided to write this book. I plan to write this novel in 4 parts, covering the past 20-odd years. The present volume covers events before the 1990s, because I feel that back then, hoodlums had a kind of purity and chivalry. They fought each other out of a sense of honor and justice, rather than for fame and wealth. The second volume covers events from 1990 to 1996, because I feel that at this point, the world views of many gangsters shifted toward crass materialism. The third part covers events from 1997 to 2000, when gangs acquired the qualities of genuine organized crime syndicates. And the fourth part covers events from 2000 to the present. The text that follows will be narrated through the eyes of several young people of the 1980s. The story involves joy and sorrow, coming together and breaking apart. Because, in the end, aren't these the things that constitute our lives? In the story that follows, Ergou is me, and I am Ergou. Prologue. A Boy's Unnatural Death. This prologue relates a story that is only loosely related to the novel that follows, in honor of a classmate who passed away 12 years ago. On Christmas Day 2007, when Ergou was on his way to Weihai Road to have dinner with some friends, he saw a 5-story purple Christmas tree at the entrance to the square. His heart quaked in recognition. More than 10 years earlier, a classmate, a simple, decent boy, had given Ergou a greeting card imprinted with the image of an identical Christmas tree. Soon after, he had met with an unhappy fate. Ergou had kept that card all these years. Back then, Ergou was in 8th grade. He was a member of his class's study committee and the English class monitor. 8th grade had just begun when a new student with a very odd surname was transferred in. The other students didn't know how to pronounce his surname, and even the teachers were unfamiliar with it. So they just called him by his given name, Guang Hui. Guang Hui had just moved to the city from a rural village. His father worked on a construction site, and his mother earned money at home knitting sweaters. Guang Hui was an only child, and at 17 was older than the rest of his class by 2 or 3 years. His parents had gone through a lot to get him into urban middle school. Guang Hui was a simple and honest boy, guileless and eager to help others. He resembled the boy Run Tu in Lu Xun's story My Old Home. Because he had just arrived from the countryside, his clothing was shabby and worn. He studied hard at school, but never really excelled, and his English was so poor that nobody understood him. The head teacher had him share a desk with the girl whose English was the best, and who had previously been Ergou's deskmate. The girl despised Guang Hui's shabby appearance and refused to talk with him, hardly even sparing him a glance. So whenever he had a question, Guang Hui usually turned around and asked Ergou. When Ergou was small, his parents had taken him to stay with his grandmother in the countryside, so he had nothing against Guang Hui. In fact, he thought he was great and was happy to answer his questions. Over time, Ergou and Guang Hui became good friends, and Ergou often gave Guang Hui a ride on his bicycle to and from school. Guang Hui couldn't afford a bike of his own. Back then, in 1994 and 95, bicycles were a luxury. Ergou's family was rather comfortably off, and his parents had bought him a racing bike with different speeds when he reached 7th grade. Ergou still remembers that bicycle. It was red and cost 1,100 kwai, and was the first racing bike owned by anyone in his middle school. Guang Hui and Ergou's homes lay in the same direction, so Ergou could take Guang Hui part of the way. Since other classmates looked down on Guang Hui, he felt deeply indebted to Ergou. When he learned that Ergou's parents were too busy to make breakfast, he started bringing Ergou one of his mother's homemade sesame pancakes every morning. Ergou still remembers the taste of Guang Hui's mother's delicious pancakes, soft and spongy inside with a crispy exterior. The incident related here occurred the winter after Guang Hui arrived at Ergou's school. Physical education class in winter usually consisted of free activities, and the most popular sport at the time was badminton. On that particular day, a girl student hit the shuttlecock onto the eaves of the sports equipment shed outside the school. The shed was about 8 feet high, and none of the students was tall enough to climb onto it. At that time, the school had only one shuttlecock, so everyone was anxious to retrieve it. Guang Hui came forward in his usual helpful way and said, "Let me try." The other students became excited. Someone offered to boost Guang Hui up on his shoulders, but Guang Hui smiled and said it was unnecessary. We watched as Guang Hui backed up a dozen paces, then with a running leap landed his foot on the windowsill, propelling himself upward until his left hand grasped the wide ledge beneath the roof of the shed. With a burst of strength, he reached his right hand onto the roof and then swung himself high enough for his left hand to knock the shuttlecock off the roof. He then reversed the process to land safe and sound on the ground. What a display! He had done all of this with such effortless agility that his classmates could only look on in mute wonder. It was like watching a masked marauder in the movies. His classmates were amazed, as was the section head for that grade, Mr. Wang, and Ergou's head teacher and English teacher, Ms. Feng, who were passing by at the time. "What was that?" said section head Wang in a tone of voice that could have been admiring or critical. Assuming the latter, Ms. Feng shouted, "That's very dangerous. Don't go up there again. If you do, I'll call your parents. I never knew you were such a rascal." Bowing his head, Guang Hui said, "I won't do it again, Miss Feng." Nodding, Ms. Feng and section head Wang walked off. Not 5 minutes after they left, another classmate, Han Chin, hit the shuttlecock back onto the roof of the equipment room. There was still a quarter of an hour of phys ed left. Han Chin wanted to keep playing badminton, but he couldn't get onto the roof. Short and stout, Han was a good student, but he had an overbearing attitude because his cousin, Han Bing, was the middle school's top dog. Han Chin smiled at Guanghui and said, "Help me get the shuttlecock down, will you?" "Ms. Feng doesn't want me going up there," Guanghui said. "You heard what she said." "Don't worry," said Han Chin. "She's gone." "I'm not going up there. If I do, I'll get in trouble," said Guanghui. Ergou knew that Guanghui treasured his hard-won opportunity to study in an urban school and feared getting in trouble with the teachers more than anything. "Damn it, are you going up there or not?" demanded Han Chin, who had always looked down on Guanghui. "No, I'm not," said Guanghui. "If you don't, I'll whip you," said Han Chin, enraged. "Go ahead, I still won't," said Guanghui. He had barely finished speaking when Han Chin charged at him and punched him in the face. Guanghui was too well behaved to hit back. "Are you going up there or not?" demanded Han Chin, even more aggressively when he saw that Guanghui wouldn't fight back. "Why did you hit me?" Guanghui cried. "I'm not going up." Han Chin aimed a kick at Guanghui, but Guanghui ducked and at the same time reached out and flung Han Chin's leg backward, sending him tumbling. There was snow on the ground that day, making Han Chin's fall even more awkward. The other students hooted with laughter. His rage fueled by embarrassment, Han Chin leapt up and began tussling with Guanghui, who by now was also provoked. The two began raining blows on each other. Most of the class just looked on. Whenever someone intervened, it was usually on Han Chin's side. Ergou tried to pull them apart, but the two boys were battling too fiercely. Just then, Ms. Feng rushed over and bellowed, "Stop fighting!" All of the middle school students feared their teachers. As soon as they heard the head teacher yell, the two boys stopped fighting. At this point, it was clear that even with others helping him, Han Chin had come off worse. His nose was smashed and blood covered his face, while Guanghui seemed barely to have been touched. "Both of you, come to my office!" cried Ms. Feng. Guanghui and Han Chin followed her, heads bowed. Phys ed class ended 10 minutes later. As the English class monitor, Ergou went to Ms. Feng's office to collect the homework. As soon as he entered the office, he saw Guanghui sitting alone. Han Chin had been sent to the school clinic for his nosebleed. "Guanghui, why were you fighting?" Ms. Feng started out. "Han Chin hit me." "He hit you. Why you and not someone else?" Ms. Feng demanded. Inarticulate at the best of times, Guanghui was speechless in the face of Ms. Feng's shrewish fulmination. In his 3 years at middle school, Ergou had heard this teacher settle a case on countless occasions. "Why did he hit you and not someone else?" seemed to be her classic, most plausible, and most unanswerable question. In the 11 years that Ergou spent in elementary school, middle school, and high school, he encountered many thoroughly unreasonable teachers like Ms. Feng. If she had sincerely listened to Guanghui's explanation instead of treating him the same as Han Chin, the subsequent events might never have occurred. That afternoon, after the kangaroo court in Ms. Feng's office, Han Chin muttered to Guanghui, "Just you wait." After school, Ergou gave Guanghui a ride home as always. Around 200 yards from the school, they were surrounded by Han Chin and several others, including Han Chin's cousin, Han Bing, whom Han Chin had obviously called in to avenge him. "Go away, Ergou. This has nothing to do with you." But Ergou tried to smooth things over. "Are you planning to beat up Guanghui?" he asked. "He's your classmate. Why do you want to beat him?" "Stay out of it, Ergou," barked Han Chin. "I need to set him straight." "Well, I'm here, and you're both my classmates. Neither of you is going to do any hitting," Ergou said. Ergou knew that while Han Chin might try to bully Guanghui, he would never try it on Ergou. Although Ergou was a well-behaved fellow who never got into fights, everyone knew that his closest childhood friend was Deng Xiao, the nephew of a top gangster, Zhao Hongbing, and a well-known hoodlum. Zhao Hongbing had been like a father to Ergou, and the two were very close. Neither Han Chin nor Han Bing would even think of laying a finger on Ergou. Even still, Han Chin clearly had no intention of listening. "Get lost, Ergou. I'm going to whip him no matter what." Han Bing moved fast, pulling Guang Hui off the bicycle. Then he and the others pounced on him, punching and kicking at his head. They were wearing the army boots that were all the rage at the time, and their kicks landed hard. In a panic, Ergou threw down his bike and tried to break up the fight, but there were at least 3 people beating on Guang Hui. Ergou found it impossible to pull them off. Just then, 7 or 8 schoolmates were passing by. They dropped their bikes and ran over to break things up. Some were girls. When Han Qin and the others saw them join in, they were too ashamed to keep going. They let up on Guang Hui. Guang Hui, his face covered with blood, launched himself like a tiger at Han Bing. His fist made contact and knocked out Han Bing's front tooth. The simple and honest country boy had finally been driven into a fury. His own rage inflamed by pain. Han Bing reached out and yanked Guang Hui's hair. By then, Ergou and the other students were standing in front of Guang Hui, shielding him. "If you want to hit him, you'll have to hit me," Ergou said. "Do you want me to have Xiaobo come and reason with you? If you think Xiaobo isn't good enough, I'll have Hong Bing come instead." Ergou rarely mentioned his relationship with these ne'er-do-wells, but the other students knew that Zhao Xiaobo often came to the school looking for Ergou, and that Zhao Hongbing had fetched Ergou from school in his car several times. "This isn't over," Han Bing muttered, stalking off with Han Qin and the others. Guang Hui didn't want to go straight home and have his family see he'd been beaten, so he stopped at Ergou's home to wash up. "Han Qin and those guys went too far," Ergou said. "Why did they have to beat you up?" "I think they'll come for me again," said Guang Hui anxiously. "They won't. But if they do, I'll take Zhao Xiaobo over to talk to Han Bing, and that'll be the end of it." Ergou didn't take the matter too seriously, and this became the greatest regret of his life. If he'd gone to see Zhao Xiaobo or Zhao Hongbing that night, the subsequent events would never have happened. It wasn't out of laziness that Ergou didn't go. It was because first he didn't believe Han Bing would retaliate. When he'd said, "This isn't over," Ergou thought it was just bluster. Second, although Zhao Xiaobo had been his best pal since childhood and was his father's godson, Ergou avoided having too much contact with people like him. Not least, Zhao Xiaobo was ruthless and heavy-handed. If he were brought into this, it would end with Han Bing being beaten to a pulp. Then Han Bing would report it to the school, and Ergou would be disciplined. Ergou had a mortal fear of getting into trouble. Early the next day after the fight, Ergou noticed that Guang Hui was carrying a fruit knife. It had a yellow handle and a very long, sharp blade that gleamed in the sunlight. Guang Hui had stuck it into his belt. "Why are you bringing a knife to school?" Ergou felt compelled to ask after second period as the class went out for morning exercises. "For self-defense," said Guang Hui with his usual honest smile. "Are you crazy?" Ergou said. "Stick it in your book bag, quick." "I fibbed to my parents and asked for 5 kwai, said Guang Hui. "I bought this knife for 260 and got this for you." He handed Ergou a huge greeting card. In those days, most greeting cards were very small, but this one was letter size. On it was printed a large purple Christmas tree. Unlike ordinary greeting cards, this one was sprinkled with glittery stars. It was clearly top quality. Ergou had received maybe 20 cards in his life, and this was by far the grandest. He knew it must have cost at least 2 kuai. Usually, Guang Hui was reluctant to spend even 10 cents on cotton candy, and for him to spend so much on a card moved Ergou very much. To this day, Ergou remembers what was written in it. "As long as swans may soar, may you reach the heights with them." "Thank you, Guang Hui," he said. "Don't mention it." "Go ahead. I'm on duty in the classroom today, so I'm not going out for exercise." "Lucky you. Okay, see you later." These were the last words Guang Hui ever spoke to Ergou. He didn't go out for exercise, so he didn't see exactly what happened. An eyewitness described it to him. After the morning exercises finished, Han Bing and his classmates went over to Guang Hui. They hauled him behind the school building and beat him up. While he was being beaten, Guang Hui pulled out his yellow-handled fruit knife. With his hair pulled so his head was bent down toward his waist, Guang Hui couldn't see who was in front of him. He just slashed out in a frenzy. The person he stabbed was Han Bing. He stabbed him 6 times, and each stroke was deadly. The others who had ganged up on Guang Hui scattered in every direction. Afterward, the school police took Guang Hui away. 20 minutes later, the news came back that Han Bing had died in hospital. Ergou's deepest impression was of Han Bing's mother, a middle-aged woman whose graying hair made her look much older. Her anguished keening echoed in Ergou's ears. "Give my son back!" she screamed, her cracked and calloused hands grabbing the collar of Miss Feng's shirt as she ran into the room. "Your boy was killed by a student, not by me," said Miss Feng, shrewish as ever. "Give back my son!" howled Han Bing's mother, who by then was out of her senses and hoarse from repeating those words. "If you don't let go, I'm calling the school guards," said Miss Feng in a towering rage. "Give me back my son!" Too weak to even cry out anymore, Han Bing's mother was frozen in place. "Let go, I tell you." Miss Feng tore away the hands that gripped her collar and stalked out of the room. Han Bing's mother lay on the podium sobbing until some girls went over and helped her out of the room. When Han Bing's mother entered the classroom, Ergou recognized her as the old lady who sold melon seeds in front of the railway workers' cultural palace. He had always thought she must be at least 50 years old, and had never guessed she had a son who was only 15. He later learned that Han Bing's father had died. As his mother was basically uneducated, she could only eke out a living from her little stall in front of the cultural palace, selling melon seeds for 30 or 50 cents to pay for Han Bing's school books. Han Bing had been all she had to live for, and now he was dead. After that, Ergou no longer saw Han Bing's mother plying her trade. It was not until the Dragon Boat Festival 3 years later, when he was in the last year of high school and was riding his bicycle to the East Wind movie theater, that he once again saw the woman sitting on the roadside. Her hair white and matted, her face wrinkled. She looked very old and frail. Her hand clutched a wooden stick from which hung folded paper gourds. It was customary in these parts to hang these colorful gourds in the windows of homes as good luck charms during the Dragon Boat Festival. "How much are these, Auntie?" Ergou asked, stopping his bike. 1 kuai each, said Han Bing's mother, eyes lowered. "I'll buy them all." Ergou took out the 10 kuai his mother had given him for lunch and bought the 7 paper gourds. "Son, here's your change," said Han Bing's mother, handing him the 3 kuai with a faint smile on her lips. Ergou took the gourds and got back on his bike, his heart heavy. Of course, Han Bing had been wrong to pick on Guanghui. But did he deserve to lose his life? Was it really worth dying in the prime of his youth over such a trifling matter? And what about Guanghui? This country boy with the goofy smile had become a murderer before the age of 16. 7 months later, he'd been beaten to death by his fellow prisoners. He had outlived Han Bing by only 7 months, likewise paying for this incident with his life. The world was funny that way. Some hooligans spent the first half of their lives beating and killing and were still hale and hearty at 50 years old, while others died in their very first fight. 2 young lives had withered and fallen like blossoms. One became known among the students as the biggest hooligan in the 100-year history of the school, the notorious Guanghui. That simple, honest boy who had always said, "Ergou, would you like a pancake? My mom made it." Ergou's heart ached as he wept. But what does this incident mean? That those who deserve to die live on? That those who don't deserve it die young? Can this be fate? When someone does something wrong, often those who suffer the most for it are their parents or others who love them. And people who are good, or who were once good, are often perceived by others as irredeemable scoundrels. When people go bad, other apparently upstanding people should bear some of the blame. In the story that follows, we'll meet some veteran soldiers who fought bloody battles protecting their country's territory and the safety of its people on the mountainous Laoshan front line on China's southern border. Spending their youth in damp air raid shelters, mustering their courage against the thundering cannon fire of the Vietnamese. Then, years after being demobilized, they turned their striking knives and double-barreled shotguns on the countrymen they'd risked their lives to protect. Just like Guanghui. Part 1. Demobilized. Chapter 1. Zhao Hongbing and his comrades in arms. Shortly before Spring Festival in 1985, Kong Ergou came to the end of his 3-year education by peasants in his grandmother's village and boarded a jeep that took him back to the city. The first real events of his life could be said to have started that day. It was only years later that he realized his rural exile was the result of the substandard living quarters assigned by his father's work unit. Drafty in winter and leaking rain all summer, the quarters were unsuitable for raising a child. So as soon as Ergou was weaned, he was sent to the countryside to live with his grandma. In 1985, the factory allocated new housing to workers of departmental grade or above, providing each of these 7 families with a 2-story, standalone unit within the factory compound. Ergou's father was promoted just in time to be allocated one of these units, and he immediately sent for his son. It was a neighbor in this compound who exposed Ergou to the kind of violence that dutiful individuals like himself would normally never hear of or even imagine. The first person Ergou met on his return to the city was Mr. Zhao. After winding through the city's streets, the jeep finally stopped outside a row of 2-story houses. Ergou's father opened the first door to the courtyard and then went eagerly to open the second door to the house. However, it was stuck. Perspiration streamed down his face as he tried to force it. The weather was cold. Missing his grandma, Ergou began to cry. He had just started sniveling when he heard a thundering voice from the neighboring courtyard. "Zhao Kong, what's going on?" Ergou had never heard such bellowing. More than 20 years later, he still recalls it as the manliest voice he ever heard. It startled him out of his weeping just as his father replied, "Director Zhao, the door is jammed." More noise from the neighboring courtyard, the sound of laughter. Even his laughter was impressive. "Let me have a look." Through the outer door came a man in his 50s, wearing a dark blue woolen Mao jacket. His back was ramrod straight, and his resolute face was unlined but for a deep crease running down each side of his mouth. His eyes gleamed with vigor and were crowned with the thick, black eyebrows of a man of character. Without saying anything to Ergou's father, the old man walked straight over to the boy and grabbed him by the cheek, roaring, "Keep crying, ball calf." There was not a trace of smile on his face, and his words hit home. Dumbstruck by the man's sternness, Ergou didn't dare utter another whimper. While Ergou came up to be a conscientious, cautious, and decent fellow, he was a very naughty child, prone to howling. One weekend, 2 or 3 years later, when he was at his mother's office watching television with some other children, one of his mother's colleagues switched the channel from Captain Kitty. Ergou was distraught and howled, "I want Captain Kitty!" Everyone in the office quaked at the sound. In the years that followed, children who had been watching television with Ergou that day often threatened their parents by saying, "Watch out, or I'll yell like Ergou." The only reason Ergou stopped howling that day was that his mother whispered, "Mr. Zhao is here." At that, the boy fell silent and minded his manners. Back at the entrance to the house, the old man took the key from Ergou's father and twisted it a couple of times with no result. Knitting his eyebrows wordlessly, he turned and left. 5 minutes later, he returned with a pencil, a jackknife, and a piece of paper. He began whittling the pencil with the jackknife, creating a little pile of lead fillings on the piece of paper. He then picked up the paper, folded it into a funnel, and slowly poured some of the fillings into the keyhole. Then he picked up the key again and turned it lightly. The door opened. "There you go," the older man said with a hearty laugh. "It just needed some lubrication." "Director Zhao, please come in," said Ergou's father. They went into the house. Ergou's mother put the kettle on while the boy went exploring. Everything in the house was new to Ergou, and he made several circuits of the upstairs and downstairs areas. It was the first time he'd seen a house that was 2 stories tall, and the first time he'd seen an electric light. "I hear Hongbing has been demobilized and is coming home," said Ergou's father. "That's right," the older man chuckled. "I hear he was awarded a medal in the war." "Yes, he did well enough just to come back alive." "It's been years since we've seen Hongbing," said Ergou's father. "I look forward to having a good chat with him over Spring Festival." Mr. Zhao turned to leave. "I've held you up long enough. It's time for me to go." He headed to the door before Ergou's father could urge him to stay. Before he left, he paused and said, "Zhao Kong, now that you're all together again and we're neighbors, come over for dinner at the Lunar New Year." It sounded like an order as much as an invitation. Ergou's father didn't bother to demur. "All right, we'll be there." During this brief conversation, Ergou was impressed by the older man's humor, straightforwardness, and commanding presence. Mr. Xiao remained the object of his deepest admiration until the day he died. Ergou later learned that Mr. Xiao had been transferred to head up the municipal organization department and would take up his new post after the Spring Festival. Before that, he'd been the head of Ergou's father's work unit, and Ergou's father had been his secretary since graduating from college. The work unit employed many people who had gone to college before the Cultural Revolution disrupted the education system. Among them, Director Zhao held Ergou's father in highest regard. The two men were more like father and son than merely colleagues. The Hongbing they spoke of was Mr. Zhao's second son, who had just returned from living up to his patriotic name, Red Soldier, as a military scout on the Laoshan battlefront. Hongbing had 3 elder sisters and an elder brother, and their strict upbringing had ensured that they were all law-abiding citizens. Their mother had died during the Cultural Revolution due to her controversial political background. Director Zhao had never remarried. Whenever something bothered him, he spoke to the portrait of his dead wife. The two had clearly been devoted to each other. The older Zhao siblings had already settled elsewhere in the city, leaving only Hongbing and his father in the small 2-story house. Ergou saw Zhao Hongbing the very next day when he went out early in his gloves and cotton army cap to sweep away the snow. Technically, each household was responsible for sweeping the snow in front of their own quarters, but Zhao Hongbing did all 7 houses, leaving his own for last. His work was meticulous. The snow piles in front of each house were uniform and evenly spaced. When Hongbing saw Ergou's father take the boy out on his bicycle, he stopped for a moment and set aside his broom, calling out, "Brother Kong!" He dashed over to Ergou's father and gave him a bear hug, nearly tipping over the bicycle. Taking off one glove, he pinched Ergou's cheek and asked, "What's your name?" When the boy told him, Hongbing laughed and said, "That's a great name." Ergou studied Zhao Hongbing carefully and noticed large eyes, a high bridged nose, and the same thick, distinguished eyebrows as his father's. He looked like a handsomer version of the elder Mr. Zhao. His face was slim rather than square, a movie star's face with the kind of hero's brow that seemed to vanish in China's young men after the 1980s. Ergou liked the look of him and wanted to be his friend. "You've filled out, Hongbing," Ergou's father remarked. "You too, around the middle. Seems you've been through a lot over the last few years." Zhao Hongbing stood to attention and threw a salute. "Serving the people." Ergou and his father laughed. "I'm taking Ergou to have his hair cut before New Year. If we get there early, we won't have to wait in line. I'll catch up with you when we get back." "All right," Hongbing said good-naturedly. As Ergou and his father rode off on the bicycle, Hongbing called after them, "Brother Kong, my dad says you're all coming over for New Year's dinner. We're looking forward to it." "Us too," Ergou's father called back. The handsome, jovial Zhao Hongbing left a very good impression on Ergou that day. There had been no vigorous young man like him in the production brigade where Ergou's grandmother lived, nor in the rest of the village. On the afternoon of New Year's Eve, Ergou's family went to Director Zhao's house for dinner. The place was bustling with excitement. Apart from Hongbing, all of Mr. Zhao's children were married. Most of their children had been born around 1980, making them about the same age as Ergou. Ergou forgot how much he missed his grandma as he played with Mr. Zhao's grandchildren downstairs while the grown-ups took their place at the table. As the core member of the family, old Mr. Zhao took the innermost seat with his children and Ergou's parents in a lively circle around him. The usual taciturn Mr. Zhao was especially cheery and talkative. Accustomed to the role of leader, he cleared his throat to speak a few words before dinner. His children fell silent, laying their chopsticks on the table. The little ones settled down as well. Mr. Zhao said, "Our city has had an abundant harvest this year. Since the 3rd plenum of the 11th Central Committee, living standards have improved. The farmers will live well this year. We have much to celebrate." Later, Ergou realized that once a family feast exceeded 6 people, Mr. Zhao turned it into a party congress. The old revolutionary never changed his ways. After his opening remarks, Mr. Zhao paused and said, "The good news for our family is that Hongbing has been honorably discharged. Let's drink a toast to him. Hongbing, You're now old enough to drink at home, but you mustn't drink too much apart from on New Year." Everyone raised their glasses and drank down the fiery Oolong-e liqueur. The mood grew even warmer. It didn't take long for some of the adults to feel tipsy. Soon it was time for the children to eat. Having just arrived from the countryside, Ergo didn't know the rules. Sitting at his mother's side, he reached for a pastry. Before he could grab it, there was a cracking sound, and he felt a dash of pain across his knuckles. Mr. Zhao had given him a sharp rap with his chopsticks. From then on, Ergo understood that he had to eat with chopsticks rather than using his hands, especially when so many people were present. He developed the habit of never putting anything in his mouth without chopsticks. At college, his classmates laughed at him for eating steamed buns with chopsticks instead of grabbing them with his fingers. When he started working, his colleagues ridiculed him for asking the waiter for chopsticks when he ate crayfish. Old Mr. Zhao probably never anticipated the lasting effect of his punishment. As everyone drank and the mood livened, tongues loosened, Zhao Hongbing was something of a lightweight. Soon he was thoroughly drunk and began to ramble about fighting the Vietnamese, gesticulating wildly as he spoke. That's when both Ergo and his father noticed that 3 of the fingers on Hongbing's right hand were missing the top 2 joints. The skin over the stumps was well healed, indicating an old injury. "Hongbing," Ergo's father said with surprise, "your hand." Hongbing shrugged. "It was crushed by a rock in battle." The mood immediately fell. Zhao Hongbing hated it when people mentioned his injury. During the winter, he wore thick gloves when he went out. Indoors, he kept his hand rolled into a fist to conceal the missing portions of his fingers. He often kept his right hand in his pocket. Although he'd lost his fingers 5 months earlier, he still found it hard to accept his disability and was too proud to let others see it. This handsome young man had become known in the city for his talents and kindness by the time he was 16 or 17. He was good at basketball and ping pong. Coming from a senior cadre household, the elder Mr. Zhao was the director of a provincial deputy department, made him even more popular with the girls. Following his demobilization, the rigors of military service lent him a heroic air that made him even more irresistible to women, and yet he was rendered semi-disabled at the age of 22. It was Hongbing's pride and his shame over his missing fingers that sparked the tragedy of his subsequent years. At a New Year's gathering after Ergo was grown, Hongbing told him that he regretted the path he had taken. Ergo said, "You know it was your character and your situation after discharge that set you on this road." Hongbing said, "It could have been different." "How?" "If my medical treatment had been a little better, or if the doctors had tried a little harder, they wouldn't have had to amputate my fingers." Ergo couldn't think of anything to say. That lunar New Year's Eve was 20 years after their first New Year's feast together. As before, snowflakes floated outside the window. In those 20 years, Ergo had grown from a callow boy who was just beginning to notice things into a capable young man, while Zhao Hongbing had transformed from a decorated soldier into one of the city's most notorious gang leaders. That day, Ergo was about the same age as Zhao Hongbing had been at their first meeting. The difference was, Ergo at 22 was full of hope and promise, while Zhao Hongbing had been filled with despair over his missing fingers. That year, Zhao Hongbing introduced Ergo to 3 comrades in arms who had been discharged with him: Fei Se, Xiao Ji, and Li Se. They hadn't fought in the same unit, but they'd been at high school together. They joined the army at the same time and enlisted in the same army group. Because the urban enlistment quota was limited, these young men felt a strong connection with each other, even though they'd served in different army units. Li Se and Zhao Hongbing had both been army scouts, while Fei Se and Xiao Ji had been artillerymen. All 4 had fought in the major skirmish at Laoshan in April of 1984. Fei Se was tall and powerfully built, a full 6 feet tall. While far from handsome, he had a manly air. Loud and brimming with energy, he came across as a sincere and honest man. Following his discharge, he'd been assigned a job as a driver for the Industry and Commerce Department and had started working just before Spring Festival. Li Se had become an odd-job man for the municipal government. He was thin and dark-complexioned with a high-ridged nose and a slightly hunched back. Hooded eyes gave him the drowsy look of an opium addict, and he was always yawning. Li Se said little, but when he did speak, he got straight to the point. Xiao Qi had been assigned work in a small town about 20 miles from the city. However, he declined it and instead opened a recycling stall not far from Zhao Hongbing's home. He took in mainly scrap metal, along with antiques and spare parts stolen from factory machinery. He had a shifty smile that implied he always was up to something. Although Ergou had begun associating with the four of them at an early age, he only ever knew them by their nicknames. It was only years later, when he saw their verdicts posted outside the courthouse, that he finally learned their proper names. Just as the falling leaf signals autumn, that spring festival dinner gave Ergou a glimpse of what was in store for these young men. Fei Se and Xiao Ji were the first to arrive at Hongbing's home to pay their respects on the first day of the Lunar New Year. The elder, Mr. Zhao, had set off early in the morning to exchange greetings at the municipal guest house, and Hongbing was left home alone. Back in the 1980s, leisure activities were limited, so during Spring Festival, young people liked to set off fireworks for entertainment. Ergou's city welcomed the god of wealth with firecrackers first thing in the morning. When Fei Se, Xiao Ji, and Lisa arrived at Hongbing's home that morning, they put on a real show for the compound's residents. Fei Se had a special method for setting off fireworks, known as the double bang. Usually, people would place the rocket on the ground, light the fuse, and then run away. But in Ergou's city, the custom had always been more daring, with adults and children holding the fireworks in their hands, pointing them upward and lighting the fuse. The first explosion would send the rocket shooting into the sky, where it would then explode a second time. While dangerous, it only caused a problem if the second explosion occurred too close to the ground. Fei Se achieved his double bang by grasping the rocket firmly in his right hand and pointing it upward, lighting the fuse with his left hand. When the firework exploded for the first time in his hand, he didn't let it go. He held it until about 2 seconds before it was about to explode. Then he threw it like a hand grenade so it went off just 15 feet in the air with a massive bang. No one dared watch, but Fei Se laughed his head off. He seemed to need that jolt of danger. As a former artilleryman, he had nothing to fear from fireworks. Ergou's father gave him a terse appraisal, calling him a draft animal. Fei Se's method put his daring and unruliness to best effect, while Xiao Ji's method demonstrated his violent tendencies. At that time, Hongbing's family owned a German shepherd, which attracted Xiao Ji's interest the moment he walked in the door. Hongbing said, "Tie on some firecrackers," and Xiao Ji jumped up and attached a string of 500 firecrackers to the dog's tail. Before the dog knew what was happening, Xiao Ji lit the firecrackers. They went off with an extraordinary racket, scaring the dog witless. It began to bark madly and went running pell-mell around the courtyard. It bolted in a panic up onto the enclosing wall and then onto the roof, where it continued to run about madly. No matter what it did, the poor creature couldn't escape the firecrackers tied to its tail. It circled the roof 2 or 3 times before they finally stopped exploding. Even then, the dog was terrified. Its legs were trembling. The incident, along with Xiao Qi's wild laughter, remained deeply etched in Ergou's memory. It was just at this time that the elder Mr. Zhao came home from paying his New Year's respects. Opening the door, he was greeted with the sight of his beloved dog running around on the roof with a string of firecrackers tied to its tail. Filled with rage, he walked over to Xiao Qi and gave him a kicking. Ergou was impressed that Mr. Zhao knew exactly who had set the firecrackers. He clearly had the full measure of his son's friends. It was only Li Se who didn't do anything with firecrackers that day. Ergou initially thought it was because the young man was kinder and less of a trickster than the others, but within 5 days his impression had completely changed. On the 6th day of Lunar New Year, Zhao Hongbing took Ergou and his nephew Zhao Xiaobo to spend some time at Li Se's work unit. It was a local custom for rural folk troops to dance with pipes and drums in the street, and then go to each work unit to pay their New Year's respects, a pretext for asking for money. That year, 5 or 6 groups came with their hands out, and it grew tedious after a while. Li Se was responsible for handing out the money to the song and dance troops, but he had no patience for this petty extortion. Even though his work unit leader had given him money, he didn't want to give it out. Instead, he took out a bucket used for storing carbon paper, which was about 3 feet deep and a foot in diameter. Using this as the core, he pasted layer after layer of brown wrapping paper around it until its proportions were about the same as those of a double-bang firecracker. Then, he wrapped it in red paper left over from writing New Year's scrolls. At the bottom, he drilled a hole and threaded a fuse made of brown wrapping paper. This produced the biggest double-banger in human history, but it was fake and would never make a sound. This prop played a crucial role in Li Si's plot. At around 11 o'clock that morning, just as he had finished making it, a song and dance troupe arrived in the courtyard of the municipal government office building and began to perform. It was clear that they had no intention of leaving until someone came out with money. What they got instead was an extra-large double banger. Li Si came charging out of the office building, clutching it like the hero Wang Cheng with his Bangalore torpedo in the movie Heroic Sons and Daughters. This was at the start of the reform and opening period, when all kinds of new things were appearing every day. When the dance troupe saw the gigantic double banger, they eyed it curiously as they continued to perform. To their surprise, Li Si wove among them and planted the double banger in the middle of the troupe. He then drew out the fuse and made as if to light it with a cigarette dangling from his lip. The members of the dance troupe began shrieking in terror and running in every direction. They were all on stilts, making it much harder for them to run. Some tumbled to the ground while others rushed out of the courtyard. Li Si continued to brandish the double banger, bending over it with his sleepy eyes and sly smile, making as if to light it. His performance was so convincing that the entire troupe fled from the courtyard. They stood at the gate, hands covering their ears, looking in with terror. Not a single person dared to go back. Li Si's tactic proved effective. The troupe received no money from their municipal government that day, nor did any of the others. With so much spare time on their hands, discharged soldiers like Hong Bing, Fei Si, Li Si, and Xiao Qi were guaranteed to cause trouble. Even so, Ergou never imagined that these young men would engage in so many shocking crimes, becoming underworld gang leaders with turfs of their own. Chapter 2. Never insult a soldier. Not long after Spring Festival, Zhao Hongbing was assigned a job. The Zhaos and Ergou's parents were thrilled at the news. Only Ergou and Hongbing's nephew, Zhao Xiaobo, were disgruntled by the fact that Zhao Hongbing would now only be free on weekends to take them out firing slingshots and building snow castles. Zhao Hongbing was a keen shot, felling at least 1 out of every 3 sparrows he aimed at with his crude weapon. Anyone who has used a slingshot knows how impressive this is, because some birds that are hit manage to fly off, and even some that are knocked down revive and fly away. Only those that are hit in the head never fly again. Ergou fooled around with slingshots for 9 years and broke countless windows without felling a single sparrow. Zhao Hongbing was assigned a job in the office of a bank. This office was responsible for receiving guests and arranging events for the bank's leaders. It was a fat job, with plenty of opportunities for bribes and kickbacks. Zhao Hongbing was bright-eyed, well-dressed, and refined, with none of the ruffian air that years on the battlefield can impart. The bank's president could tell at a glance that Hongbing would enhance the bank's image. Nobody could have imagined what actually transpired. The incident Zhao Hongbing encountered would be considered nothing nowadays. Anyone going to the Discipline Inspection Commission or the Anti-Corruption Bureau reporting that so-and-so was corrupt under these circumstances would be regarded as a lunatic. Zhao Hongbing was this kind of lunatic. The office where Hongbing worked regularly received guests from other banks, and Hongbing soon grew fed up. These guests were supposedly inspectors, but all they really came for was to gorge themselves. Turning their noses up at roast chicken, they insisted on fashionable foods like deep-fried pork tenderloin or sweet and sour fish, and only drank top-drawer liqueurs like Mao Tai or Uliang Ye. They would arrive in the morning to carry out their inspections, eat, and drink themselves into a stupor at lunchtime, and then spend the afternoon sleeping it off on the sofas in the bank's reception office. Once night fell, they were ready for another bacchanal. A dozen dishes would be set before them, and they'd leave 90% of it to be thrown into the trash. Zhao Hongbing was crazy enough to find this intolerable. His heart ached at the criminal waste of state-funded food, so he began to think, how long ago was it that I enlisted? Back then, lots of people considered even rice a luxury, and now our country has become so rich that platters of meat can be tossed in the bin. And one visiting leader has to be accompanied by an entourage of a dozen lackeys. This young lunatic, born under the red flag and raised at the dawn of the nation, may not have realized that China had prospered so much during the years when he was serving his country. What he witnessed was not the result of prosperity, but of corruption. At noon, on Hong Bing's 12th day on the job, another provincial leader came down for a meeting. Within half an hour, he was gorging himself on mountains of food and oceans of liquor. The feasting continued for 3 hours before they returned to the office. The head of the reception office, Mr. Li, was Hong Bing's direct supervisor, and by the time they returned, he could hardly see straight. Hong Bing, as a staffer, had kept them company without overindulging. Of course, that's what Hong Bing said. But Ergou knew Hong Bing well enough to be sure he also drank too much that day. Hong Bing was the kind of man who drank either nothing or too much. In the 20 years Ergou had known him, there had never been an exception to this rule. No one knew what his drinking capacity was. Some said 15 ounces, some said a pint, some said a quart. He seldom drank with outsiders, but when he did, it was rice liquor, a pint to a quart or more, and always too much. The self-described sober lunatic staggered into the office that afternoon to find his boss, Mr. Li, on the phone. Back then, telephone lines were still routed through a switchboard, and the caller had to instruct the switchboard operator which number to dial. Zhao Hongbing heard Li tell the operator to connect him to the city's guest house, and his first thought was, "We just finished eating and now he's arranging for us to spend the evening wasting even more of our country's money and food?" Mustering Dutch courage, Hongbing reached out and hung up the phone. With a gust of liquored breath, Li laughed and said, "Xiao Zhao, don't be angry. I'm just reserving a table for the leader tonight." Hongbing said, "I'm not going along with this. We just left so much food behind at lunch and you're planning to eat again tonight?" Li said, "Sure, why not? What else are we going to do?" "How can you waste state funds like that?" Li realized from Hongbing's tone of voice that he wasn't joking. He said, "Xiao Zhao, don't you go out drinking with us at lunchtime? Wasn't that a waste of the state's money?" Tongue-tied for a moment, Hongbing said, "I went at lunchtime, but I'm not going next time." "That's up to you, but don't interfere with my phone call." Losing patience, Li pushed his hand away. This infuriated Zhao Hongbing, who employed his prodigious vocal cords to yell, "You're just a bunch of moths and maggots!" His use of the plural included the bank's president in his insults. "Fuck you, where do you get off criticizing others?" said Li, who was no nice guy himself. "Did we bleed on the Laoshan front to protect parasites like you? Lousy soldier boy, do you really think a few days in the army gives you the right to lecture me? Who needs your fucking protection?" "No one insults a soldier." "You cripple, if it weren't for your father." Those were the last words Li would speak for the next 2 weeks, because they were followed by a roar that shook the building, and then a crashing sound. At the hospital, the doctor asked Li's colleague, what kind of heavy object hit his chest hard enough to break so many ribs? "He was beaten." "How many people did it take to do this to him?" "One." "What did he beat him with?" "He kicked him." "How many times?" "Just once." "Who was this person that kicked him?" On hearing the answer, the doctor reportedly stood there, gaping. He had never treated such a serious kicking injury before. When the police called to follow up, he maintained that several assailants must have been involved. It was impossible to attribute so much damage to a single blow. The doctor couldn't know that Zhao Hongbing used that kick to vent his shock and indignation at society, his shame over his missing fingers, his resentment of his boss's shamelessness, and his panicked disillusionment. 12 years later, when Ergou was in his 3rd year of high school, the man Hongbing declared a maggot was brought to justice. When Ergou hurried to a public trial after school, he saw a notice posted off to the side. While serving as the vice president of the Bank of Industry and Commerce, Li XX embezzled XX million yuan in public funds for gambling. The court of first instance has sentenced him to 11 years in prison. Back at home, Ergou reported this jubilantly to Zhao Hongbing, who by then was the leader of an underworld gang. To his surprise, Hong Bing was indifferent. "Ergo, he's just one maggot. You have to remember that day I said, 'You bunch of maggots.'" It was true. A single maggot could be brought to justice, but how long would it take to deal with an entire maggot-ridden country? That's when Ergo understood that Zhao Hongbing had not been aiming his kick at just one man. For 14 years after this incident, Zhao Hongbing never again publicly referred to his military service. At least, Ergo never heard him mention it, even at gatherings of his old comrades in arms, while everyone else was recalling their experiences in the army. Hongbing kept silent. It was not until the summer of 1999, when Ergo was in college in another city and had come to visit his family, that he heard one of his high school classmates tell what he considered as a joke. Even though this happened 8 years ago, Ergo still remembers every word his old classmate said. "Ergo, did you go to the protest?" It was soon after NATO's bombing of the Chinese embassy in Belgrade, and China was still roiling with protests. "Yes, I yelled myself hoarse." "We went too, but it was ridiculous." "Bombing our embassy was a serious matter. What's ridiculous about it?" "Most of the people at the protest were local college students, but do you know who was marching at the front and yelling the loudest, and who kept marching all day after others dropped out?" "Who?" "Hong Bing. You know, Big Brother Hong Bing. He was out front with Fei Se and a bunch of other gangsters carrying a banner. They seemed to be enjoying themselves. They marched from the south side of the city to the north, then to the western waterfront and on to the cotton mill. All the punks and lowlifes standing along the road joined in when they saw Hong Bing, and by the end of the day, there must have been 200 of them with dyed hair or shaved heads, tattoos, shirtless, and in flip-flops, all kinds. By lunchtime, we reached the school, and us students dropped out to hit the canteen. That bunch of hoodlums Hong Bing led were tough, all right, marching half a day without even stopping for a drink of water. Hong Bing told the students he'd been a soldier, and so had Fei Se and Xiao Qi. They'd fought in the war, and now that the country was in trouble, if they were needed, they'd go back into the army and not be afraid to die. It was fucking hilarious. That bunch of middle-aged gangsters thinking they could go back into the army. Who would want them? If China had to depend on riffraff like that, we'd be finished. Some of my classmates said, "Who knew gangsters can be patriots too?" Ergo, why do you think they were making such asses of themselves? What do you think they were getting at? Why don't they just try committing fewer crimes or chopping up a few less people? "You're full of shit. Shut up. You don't know what you're talking about." "Ergo, what's the matter? Why are you talking like that?" "Piss off." Zhao Hongbing clearly hadn't forgotten that he'd once been a lousy soldier boy. Chapter 3. Gangland Aristocracy. Ergo was unflailingly polite, but the reason he'd told his old classmate to piss off was that he hadn't detected the slightest indignation over the American bombing of the Chinese embassy in Yugoslavia, or even a thread of sympathy for the 3 countrymen who had lost their lives in a foreign land. In his classmate's animated narrative, he couldn't detect the slightest grief over the incident. Why was such a person even protesting in the first place? He must have just wanted to join the fun. 6 years later, in 2005, on the Yin-An East Road overpass near Shanghai's People's Square, Ergo was heading home after working the night shift when he saw a couple of students with cheeky grins on their faces carrying banners calling for a boycott of Japanese products. Seeing the emptiness of the eyes in those agitated faces yelling slogans as if China had conquered the world, Ergo couldn't share their excitement. He found the whole scene unspeakably depressing. Ergo pulled the boy aside who was grinning the most and shouting the loudest and asked, "What is this protest about? Is it because some Japanese politician has gone to pay homage to the Yasukuni shrine again, or what?" The student hemmed and hawed for a while, unable to answer the question. Ergo's heart sank. He was sure that there were many patriotic and well-meaning students among the protesters, and he respected them. However, he heartily despised those who carried a Chinese flag and joined protests just for the fun of it, as if it were a carnival. Zhao Hongbing had been ridiculed for protesting because he was a hoodlum, an underworld gang leader who had been in and out of prison several times. Ergo was certain that Hongbing, who had experienced the flames of war and lost 3 fingers in battle, was every bit as patriotic as any of these protesters. But once a person was labeled a gangster, even patriotism had become a joke. Zhao Hongbing spent half a month squatting in a prison sweatbox for beating his office manager. As for Li, he returned to work after 3 months of bed rest and was considerably less arrogant. Zhao Hongbing came out of the sweatbox a different person, silent and unfathomable. With his father's influence, he could have gone back to work at the bank, but he didn't. No matter how hard his sisters urged him, he spent more than a month lying around, taking occasional strolls outside. Mr. Zhao held back from criticizing his son. Although strict, he was a reasonable man. He knew that in principle his son had been right, and that the kicking had been an act of foolish impetuosity triggered by being called a cripple. In fact, Zhao Hongbing thought a lot about what to do after losing his job. He considered joining Xiao Ci in running his recycling stall, or taking out a contract for a tour bus, or running a general store. He thought of practically every job worth considering, but never considered joining the underworld. Ergou's parents, taking Zhao Hongbing's side out of friendship and a sense of justice, proposed some ideas to him. Ergou's dad was friends with the head of a state-owned hotel near the train station, as well as with the official over him. He pushed Hongbing to take on the contract for the hotel in early 1987. After considerable negotiation, the matter was finally settled, and the new sense of direction made Zhao Hongbing noticeably cheerier. 2 or 3 months later, on a warm spring day, Zhao Hongbing was on his way to buy a spoke for his brother-in-law's bicycle. He was riding his own bike with Ergou sitting in front and his nephew, Xiao Bo, in back, when a voice behind them called out, "Hongbing! Hongbing!" Turning to look, Zhao Hongbing grinned with surprise. "Zhang Yue?" Zhang Yue climbed off his bike. "Hongbing, when were you discharged? Why haven't you come to see me?" "I don't want to talk about it. How about you? Have you graduated?" "Yes. I've been assigned a job at the grain bureau," Zhang Yue said. "How did you get back here so fast? Doesn't it take 4 years to graduate? I thought you were still at school. That's why I didn't look you up." "I just went for professional training and graduated in 3 years," laughed Zhang Yue. The two of them stood before each other, hands clasped, never guessing that this handshake would change both their fates. As the two reminisced, Ergou learned they'd been best friends in high school. Zhang Yue was a slim, pale, refined-looking fellow, well-spoken and cultivated. There was a shrewd look in his large eyes, and he had the long, slender fingers of a pianist. Months later, Ergou learned that Zhang Yue's bookish and gentle appearance was deceiving. Once his mind was set, 10 oxen couldn't hold him back. Ergou also subsequently learned that Zhang Yue was the scion of an underworld aristocracy. Back in the 1930s and 40s, Zhang Yue's grandfather was a famous brigand known as Zhen Dongyang, or Quell Japan. With 100 followers, he had swept through the region's cities to resist Japan and save the nation. They looted and pillaged, killing any Jap devil they saw and robbing any landlord or bandit they came across, in utter disregard of law and order. During their crime spree, they meted out special treatment to the Japanese, whose heads they would hang in public places. At that time, Ergou's locality was part of what was then called Manchu Kuo, a puppet state under Japanese rule. Every town was guarded by several Japanese soldiers, but never more than 10, and they were no match for 100 ferocious local bandits. The Jap devils genuinely feared the appropriately named Zhen Dongyang, whose nomadic lifestyle made him impossible to capture. Ergou heard of one exploit in which Zhen Dongyang attacked a puppet police station to free 2 of his gang members who had been arrested a month before. After entering the police compound, he stood in the doorway and bellowed, "I am Zhen Dongyang. Release my brothers now or I will burn down your police station." Only 3 policemen were on duty at the time, and they grabbed their guns and rushed out. Seeing Zhen Dongyang taunting them at the entrance of the compound, they moved to arrest him. Zhen Dongyang had thought his name alone would be enough to intimidate the policemen, but it turned out they were braver than that. Zhen Dongyang was carrying 2 Mauser pistols, known for good reason as box cannons, and he fired a warning shot to keep the policemen at bay. There were no televisions back then. Otherwise, Zhen Dongyang might have known that warning shots should always be fired in the air and not at the ground. Whether because he'd drunk too much or because the gun barrel was off kilter, Zhen Dongyang managed to shoot himself in the foot. Amazed at their luck of having the notorious Zhen Dongyang cripple himself on their watch, the policeman shouted, "Get him!" and charged forward. Seething with pain, Zhen Dongyang vented his wrath by firing at the policeman. Following an exchange of a dozen or so rounds, 2 policemen were dead and a third badly wounded, while Zhen Dongyang suffered no further injury. People say that during the shootout, the policemen were shooting and dodging bullets at the same time, while Zhen Dongyang didn't move anything but his trigger fingers. This is the kind of ruthlessness required of a bandit leader. The man who held his ground came off without a scratch, while those who ducked and dodged ended up dead or wounded. If that isn't the stuff of legend, what is? After the gunfight, Zhen Dongyang calmly freed his 2 gang brothers, and they swaggered off. A genuine resistance fighter would have packed it in after the Jap devils surrendered, but with no more enemies to be marauded against, Zhen Dongyang turned his attention to landlords. Later on, people praised him as a Robin Hood who killed the rich and helped the poor. That's not how Ergou's father saw it, though. He said Zhen killed the rich because the poor had nothing for him to steal. He helped the poor by tossing a few coins at the people his gang lodged with while they were on a run. All he cared about was money. Don't believe what they say about his noble spirit. Zhen Dongyang became so legendary that no one could catch him, neither the Jap devils, the puppet regime, nor the nationalist government. However, in 1947, he fell into the hands of the Chinese People's Liberation Army. Soon after that, he found himself kneeling by a roiling river, waiting to be executed with several other bandits. Just before the bullet could penetrate his skull, he leaped into the river, and no one knows if he lived or died. His body was never found. He was never seen again. When Zhen Dongyang escaped that bullet, he probably never dreamed that his grandson would fall before a gun more than 40 years later. This grandson was Zhang Yue. People have exaggerated the virtues of Zhen Dongyang's son, saying he was benevolent and just, rational, and not at all barbaric. But when Red Guards ransacked his home in 1966, they learned that while Zhen Dongyang's son was righteous, he was even more of a wild man than Zhen Dongyang. Since Zhang Yue's grandfather had been a bandit, his family was naturally targeted during the Cultural Revolution. Early one morning, a dozen or so Red Guards burst into the courtyard, preparing to ransack the Zhang home. But before they could proceed, Zhang Yue's father dashed out. According to one of the Red Guards who invaded the home, a female cousin of Zhao Hongbing's, they saw a rail-thin man rushing at them with a shoulder pole in his hands. He was naked except for red briefs, which failed to conceal the impressive object between his legs. Many of the female Red Guards had never seen that appendage before, and they turned away shrieking. Apparently, Zhang Yue's father had just gotten out of bed and still had his morning erection. Ergou was in awe of his cleverness, dashing out almost naked. He robbed his opponents of half their strength by disarming the girl Red Guards. "What are you doing? We're here to search your house," yelled the guards. "Go fuck your mothers, you little shits. Come one step closer and I'll waste you," hollered Zhang Yue's father. Having ransacked a multitude of homes without encountering the least resistance, the Red Guards never expected to land in this briar patch. "Get him!" cried the leader of the group, unfastening his belt buckle to use as a whip. Zhang Yue's father remained composed and simply swung the shoulder pole he was carrying. Bang! The metal belt buckle slammed against Zhang Yue's father's head. At the same moment, his pole struck the Red Guard's head, and the boy dropped to the ground. Roaring like a tiger and covered with blood, Zhang Yue's father charged through the narrow courtyard, swinging his pole at the other Red Guards, who hadn't had a chance to loosen their own belts. The Red Guards howled in pain as he rained blows on them, but he didn't strike a single one of the girls. That belt buckle to the head was the only injury Zhang Yue's father suffered. "Get the fuck out of here," he yelled. "Just you wait," said the Red Guard leader woozily as the others carried him off. An hour later, more than 100 Red Guards on bicycles whirled aggressively into the hutong where Zhang Yue's family lived, every hand carrying some kind of weapon and not a girl among them. Zhang Yue's father was waiting for them on the roof of the gatehouse at the entrance to the courtyard. He was still wearing only his red briefs, but this time he was carrying a hatchet. Behind him stood his eldest son, the 14-year-old Zhang Fei, also carrying a hatchet but dressed more appropriately than his father. It seems that the older generation was more open in those days, or maybe Zhang Yue's father, by then in his 50s, was wearing special clothes to ward off bad luck in his threshold year in the lunar calendar. Why else would a grown man have been running around in red skimpies? Everyone in the city over 50 years old knows of this battle. The army of Red Guards ground to a halt, having failed to anticipate that the elder and younger Zhangs would be waiting for them.
"You sons of bitches, what are you doing back here?"
Zhang Yue's father called down from the roof. "We're going to search your house." The Red Guard leader was older and more authoritative. As he spoke, he unbuckled his belt, and the guards behind him dismounted from their bikes and raised the scrap iron, table legs, and cleavers they were carrying. "Motherfuckers!" The elder and younger Zhang leaped down from the roof, landing less than a yard from the Red Guards, who at this point noticed that Zhang Yue's father was barefoot. "Step aside!" yelled the Red Guard leader. Zhang Yue's father didn't reply but said to his son, "That's a nice army belt he has there. Go grab it for me." Zhang Fei whipped his hatchet at the Red Guard leader, who cried out and dropped his belt to the ground. Zhang Fei picked it up. The Red Guards were dumbstruck. More than 100 of them had come to ransack this house, but they had become the underdogs, their leader disarmed in the blink of an eye. Half a minute passed, and no one moved a muscle. "Get them, son!" roared Zhang Yue's father. The elder and young Zhang plowed through the Red Guards without meeting the slightest resistance. Thoroughly unmanned by this unexpected reception, the Red Guards scrambled through the narrow hutong like rats in a trap. None of them dared fight back, overwhelmed as they were by the vehemence and ferocity of the Zhang's attack. In a matter of minutes, all that was left in the hutong was a pile of abandoned scrap metal and table legs and Zhang Yue's brother and father, completely unharmed. The rising sun sent down a beam of light that warmed the skeletal frame of Zhang Yue's father in his red briefs. Clearly his self-respect and the sanctity of his home meant more to him than life itself. According to an incomplete reckoning after the event, more than 40 Red Guards were injured in varying degrees, but none lost their lives. From then on, the number of ransackings and public denunciations in the city decreased considerably. And some said it was because of the Zhang family's ambush. In that absurd era, perhaps it was only genuine warriors who could ward off Red Guard militants dazzled by a revolution they never understood.